What if Judas wasn't the villain? What if everything we thought we knew about betrayal, loyalty, and the final days of Jesus was built on the wrong gospel? Yeah, I know how that sounds. But buried for centuries in a crumbling codex, there's a version of the story where Judas doesn't sell out Jesus, he obeys him. Willingly. As part of some divine plan. It's called the Gospel of Judas, and the church didn't just ignore it. They buried it, literally and theologically. This isn't a modern conspiracy theory or some half-baked idea off a Reddit thread. It's a real ancient manuscript, written in Coptic, discovered in pieces, restored by scholars, and still causing theological headaches today. The questions it raises aren't just historical, they're deeply personal. What if the villain was following orders? What if loyalty looks like betrayal? So, how did this text survive? Why was it banned? And what exactly does it say that made religious authorities lose their minds? And maybe the bigger question, why are we only hearing about it now? If you've ever felt like history handed you the neat version and left out the weird stuff, this one's for you. The Gospel of Judas isn't your typical Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John account. You won't find familiar stories of Jesus walking on water or feeding crowds with fish and bread. Instead, it's more like a series of intense philosophical conversations, mostly between Jesus and Judas Iscariot. The Gospel of Judas opens with Jesus dropping some deep revelations during a private conversation with Judas, just a few days before Passover. In this version, Jesus doesn't act like the version many of us are used to. He laughs. A lot. Not in a warm, friendly kind of way, but more like he's surrounded by people who just don't understand him. At one point, his disciples are gathered for what seems like a Thanksgiving-style meal, and Jesus just laughs at them for praying to what he calls your God. Not his God. Theirs. That's one of the Gospel's core ideas. The Old Testament God, the one the disciples are praying to, is seen as a lesser deity. Not evil exactly, but misguided and far removed from the true divine essence. According to this text, the real God is a totally invisible, unknowable spirit that is completely different from the creator of the physical world, which is described here as flawed and corrupt. This telling emphasizes the disciples' consistent misinterpretation and lack of comprehension. They're focused on earthly rituals, animal sacrifices, and old traditions. Jesus basically says they've missed the point entirely. Only Judas gets pulled aside and told the real story. Jesus tells Judas that he's special, that he actually understands the big picture. He even tells Judas to step away from the others so he can share the true mysteries of the kingdom with him. And what are these mysteries? Jesus shares a cosmology about a universe made up of emanations called eons, layers of reality that stretch way beyond anything we can see. The physical world, he says, was created by an inferior being. It's a bit like saying the world is a bootleg version of what was actually intended, a knockoff reality. Only a few people are considered worthy of this knowledge. It's not about faith or good deeds. It's about gnosis, which is called secret knowledge. Judas somehow is seen as one of the chosen few. In the Gospel of Judas, one event that happened comes to mind. The disciples come to Jesus with a troubling dream. They describe scenes of sacrificing wives and children, sleeping with men, committing murder, and other dark acts. Jesus listens, then tells them something even more troubling. He says they are the ones doing these things. They are worshipping a false god, the demiurge known as Yaldabaoth. But Judas is different. Later in the text, he shows a rare understanding. He recognizes that Jesus comes from the immortal realm of Barbelo. He even names the one who sent him. In a vision, he sees a vast house, immeasurable, roofed with grass, surrounded by figures of great significance. And here's the biggest twist. In this version of the story, Judas isn't the villain. He's not the guy who betrayed Jesus out of greed or under demonic influence. Nope. He's the one Jesus trusted the most. Jesus asked him to do it, and that was all part of the plan. Jesus tells Judas that to complete his mission, he needs to get rid of the body. In other words, Judas is supposed to help Jesus shed his physical form, his mortal flesh, so he can return to the divine realm. There's a line where Jesus says, "Sacrifice the man who bears me." That's Jesus basically saying, help me break out of this body. It's believed that it's not that Judas wanted to hurt Jesus. It's that he understood what the others didn't. That Jesus needed to die, not because he failed, but because his death was the way back to the true spiritual world. Judas becomes the only one who really gets it. even if history would label him a traitor for it. There's even a vision in the text where Judas sees the other disciples attacking him. They're stoning him, persecuting him. It's like a flash forward to the kind of legacy he'll have. Reviled, misunderstood, turned into the ultimate backstabber, and yet Jesus tells him, "But you will exceed all of them." Eventually, Judas goes to the Jewish scribes. He talks with them, agrees to their plan, takes the money, and hands Jesus over, just like in the familiar story. But the Gospel of Judas ends there. No trial, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Just Judas fulfilling what he believes is a divine assignment. And that's kind of the point. The text doesn't bother with the rest. It's not trying to compete with the New Testament beat for beat. It's offering a reinterpretation. And whether you buy it or not, it definitely makes you rethink the stories you thought you knew. But where on earth did this thing come from? Well, the Gospel of Judas didn't just show up in a museum display case with a neat little label and a spotlight. Far from it. Its survival is one of those strange stories that makes you wonder how much history nearly vanished before anyone could read it. The version we know today comes from a single ancient manuscript called the Codex Chakos. Think of it as a really old book that somehow made it through centuries of decay, human error, and a little bit of shady dealing. Inside the Codex Chakos were 4 separate texts, all bundled together. Alongside the Gospel of Judas, there was a version of the letter of Peter to Philip, a short form of the first apocalypse of James, and the beginning of something scholars call allogenes, which is still a bit of a puzzle. Each one adds to this broader picture of early Christian thought that's way more diverse than many people realise. When experts carbon dated the Codex, the results landed it somewhere around 280 AD, give or take 60 years. That puts it firmly in the early 4th century. Paleographers, those who study old handwriting, came to pretty much the same conclusion. The writing style matches up with the first half of the 4th century. So, while the surviving copy is from that time, most scholars agree that the original text, the one that inspired this copy, was written much earlier, probably in the 2nd century. And it wasn't originally written in the language we have now either. The Gospel of Judas was first composed in Greek, which makes sense considering who wrote it. This was the work of Gnostic Christians, groups that were part of the early Christian movement, but with their own radically different take on theology. The term Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, and not just any knowledge. This is considered a kind of secret, inner knowledge believed to lead to spiritual salvation. It's not about rules or rituals, it's about insight. For Gnostic Christians, salvation was about waking up to deeper truths that most people were too distracted or too afraid to see. The Gospel of Judas fits right into a specific stream of Gnosticism called Sethian Gnosticism. Named after Seth, the 3rd son of Adam and Eve, this group had its own unique spiritual lineage and saw themselves as keepers of hidden wisdom. For them, Judas wasn't the villain. He was the one who saw through the illusion of the material world and recognized Jesus' true purpose. From the Gnostic point of view, the version of the story we got in the New Testament was merely one side of it. The Gospel of Judas wasn't meant to start a fight with mainstream Christianity. It was meant to offer an alternative reading for those who felt there had to be more to the story. And in the 2nd century, there were plenty of different ideas floating around about who Jesus really was, what he came to do, and how his message should be understood. This gospel reflects just one of many religious currents moving through that time. What makes this text even more valuable is that it's one of the earliest Gnostic writings we can actually date with some confidence. Scholars see it as a kind of time capsule, not just of theological ideas, but of what early Christian diversity actually looked like. It showed clearly that the early church wasn't a monolithic group where everyone agreed on everything. Far from it. Now, the path this codex took from the deserts of Egypt to modern scholarship was messy, to put it politely. Discovered in the 1970s near El Minya, Egypt, the manuscript suffered from neglect and poor storage. After passing through several dealers, it finally reached experts in the 2000s. Restoration was painstaking, to say the least. Scholars reconstructed it fragment by fragment, often working with barely legible scraps to revive its ancient message. What helped a lot was comparing it to other non-canonical texts discovered in Egypt, particularly those from the Nag Hammadi Library, which was a massive trove of ancient writings unearthed in 1945, also in Egypt, full of Gnostic Gospels and and apocalyptic writings. In fact, 2 of the other texts in the Codex Chakos, the letter of Peter to Philip, and the first revelation of James, also appear in that collection. So scholars were able to cross-reference styles, phrasing, and theological concepts to piece together a clearer picture. What all these texts had in common was a theological angle that didn't line up with the mainstream version of Christianity that was becoming dominant in the 4th century. These weren't just rejected ideas, they were deliberately left out as the church established its core doctrines. And that makes the Gospel of Judas even more fascinating. It gives us a glimpse of what could have been, a path not taken. Because here is the thing, and I hope this doesn't destroy anyone's faith, which is not my intention at all, but some certain things Christians practice today were accepted based on the belief of whoever was in charge. This is why even in the Christian community, the Bible's different. Here is what I mean. Most of what we know as the Bible is the one that has 66 chapters. But in the Catholic Church, there are more books or chapter added to their Bible. In the Jewish Bible, there are also more, and of course we have the undiluted Ethiopian Bible, which I talked extensively on, about how it is the only Bible that nothing was removed. I will add a link to the video if you are interested in it. The Ethiopian Bible is another one that is very extensive. So that's my point. One God but different versions of the Bible, based on what someone thought was right or wrong. So imagine if the Pope of his time decided to, like Judas, it could have easily gone that way. We would have a version of Christianity where knowledge, not faith alone, was the ticket to salvation. Where Judas wasn't the betrayer, but the one disciple who really saw what was going on. So you end up asking what's true and what's not. Even before anyone had the actual manuscript in hand, the Gospel of Judas was already causing a stir. It had been on the church's radar for nearly 2,000 years, not because they loved it, but because they wanted it gone. The first known mention comes from Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, around 180 AD. This was a time when the early church was trying to sort out what counted as official doctrine and what didn't. Irenaeus took it upon himself to call out anything that felt too fringe, too strange, or just too threatening. And he did not hold back. In his lengthy, no-nonsense work against heresies, he went after groups like the Gnostics with a kind of righteous fury. In one part of that book, he specifically calls out the Gospel of Judas. According to him, this wasn't just a weird offshoot. It was dangerous. He links it to a group called the Cainites, a sect that, strangely enough, saw figures like Cain and Judas, not as villains, but as misunderstood heroes. Irenaeus wrote that these people believed Judas had secret knowledge that no one else did, and that his act of betrayal was actually part of some divine plan. To him, this gospel wasn't just heretical, it was what he called a fictitious history. A couple of centuries later, another church leader, Epiphanius, picked up where Irenaeus left off. He was the Bishop of Salamis in Cyprus, and much like his predecessor, he wasn't having any of the Gnostic material. He also mentioned the Gospel of Judas, again in connection with the Cainites. Same story, same condemnation. And just like that, the Gospel of Judas vanished from the page of history. But then, sometime around the late 1970s, it reappeared. Most accounts say it was a farmer in Egypt who stumbled across it, somewhere near the town of El Minya. One version has him digging through a limestone tomb when he cracked open a box and pulled out what turned out to be a bundle of ancient texts wrapped up in leather. This discovery ranks right up there with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Library. It was that significant. And among the texts packed inside this ancient codex was the Gospel of Judas, quietly waiting to spark another wave of debate 2 millennia after it was first condemned. After being sold by the farmer to a Cairo antiquities dealer who went by the pseudonym Hannah, the codex was reportedly stolen from Hannah's apartment. Next thing you know, it's smuggled into Geneva in 1980, and then, oddly enough, Hannah manages to recover it in 1982. At that point, the manuscript was passed between dealers, and not just within Egypt, but bounced around internationally, ending up in shoeboxes, stuffed into briefcases, and stashed in dark corners of the antiquities market. In May of 1983, 2 scholars, Stephen Emmel and Ludwig Kuhnen, were flown from Dallas to Geneva by Southern Methodist University. Their mission was to check out some ancient Coptic texts being offered by a pair of extremely secretive sellers. And in one of those boxes was the Gospel of Judas, looking fragile but unmistakably old. Emil and his team could tell right away this was a big deal. But there was one massive problem. The sellers were asking for $3 million, non-negotiable. Emil practically begged the university to buy the codex, fearing that if no one stepped in, it would be lost forever. Sadly, the price was just too high. The deal fell through, and the codex disappeared yet again this time for nearly 2 decades. During that time, it ended up in a safe deposit box in Hicksville, New York. It sat there for about 16 years, tucked away in a narrow box, exposed to humidity and unstable temperatures. The codex was still owned by an Egyptian antiquities dealer who, despite several attempts, couldn't find anyone willing to buy it. Understandably, most collectors and institutions were wary, with no clear paperwork, no confirmed provenance, and an asking price that hovered in the stratosphere. It was a risky buy. So the Gospel of Judas just sat there, deteriorating. By the time scholars got their hands on it again, it was in rough shape. The leather bindings had crumbled, the pages were out of order, and some were literally stuck together. Others had disintegrated into over 1,000 fragments. Entire sections were missing. The codex had become a puzzle, with too many missing pieces and no picture on the box to guide you. Yet, even in that state, the Gospel of Judas was still clearly something remarkable. Something that, despite being buried, rejected, stolen, and nearly destroyed, had somehow survived. And what was left of it was enough to challenge everything we thought we knew about Judas Iscariot. In 2000, a Zurich-based antiquities dealer named Frieda Chakos-Nussberger bought the manuscript. She was Egyptian-born, but of Greek heritage, and after the purchase, she was the one who gave the manuscript the name Codex Chakos, in honor of her father. But it wasn't exactly a pretty sight. By then, the manuscript was in rough shape. Out of what scholars believe were 31 leaves, only 13 had survived. Some pages were missing entirely, and there were suspicions that certain leaves had been removed and sold off separately. All told, about 15 to 20% of the document was gone for good, and the part that remained had fallen apart into nearly 1,000 fragments. Touch it, and it crumbled. At first, Frieda didn't even know what she had. According to her, she had no clue the Gospel of Judas was part of the collection when she acquired it, which sort of explains why it stayed under wraps for so long. She eventually deposited the battered codex at Yale University's Beinecke Rarebook and Manuscript Library. That's where scholars like Bentley Layton and Robert Babcock finally identified the Gospel of Judas buried among the debris. In February 2001, Frieda transferred the codex to the Maecenas Foundation for Ancient Art in Basel, Switzerland. Their goal was clear: preserve, restore, and publish the manuscript, and ultimately return it to Egypt. The foundation didn't work alone. They teamed up with the National Geographic Society, the Waite Institute for Historical Discovery, and an international roster of experts to get this project off the ground. It was a massive effort. As of 2025, up to a third of it remains illegible, and there's a good chance some pages are still floating around the antiquities market, unrecognised and misplaced. However, Mario Roberti suggests that the Codex Chakos might not be the only copy of the Gospel of Judas out there. In his view, it would actually make sense if the Vatican had a copy tucked away in its archives. After all, back in the early centuries, when church leaders were deciding which Gospels made the cut and which ones got branded heresy, you'd imagine they might have quietly kept some records of what they banned. But when asked, Pope Benedict XVI said no. Though most people didn't believe him, and can you blame them? I mean, it's the Catholic Church we are talking about with centuries of sins. But the irony of it was that in this case, they were telling the truth. They didn't have the Gospel of Judas. Spokespersons were quick to push back on any claims of a cover-up. Monsignor Walter Brandmiller, who headed the Vatican's Committee for Historical Science, welcomed the manuscript. He said it was like any other ancient text worth studying. And Father Thomas Williams, Dean of Theology at the Regina Apostolorum University in Rome, went a bit further. He dismissed all the cover-up talk as untrue. He even pointed out that you can buy copies of Gnostic text in Catholic bookstores. Luckily, on April 6, 2006, the National Geographic Society officially announced the completion of the restoration and translation project. They released a book containing the translated text, annotated by scholars, and even followed it up with a 2-hour documentary. That aired on the National Geographic Channel just a few days later, on April 9, 2006. Suddenly, a manuscript that had spent most of its existence either buried or forgotten was getting primetime attention, and they didn't stop there. In 2007, National Geographic released a critical edition of the codex. This wasn't just a reprint with a fancy cover. It included high-resolution images of all the fragments, the full reconstructed Coptic text, and translations in both English and French. They also corrected parts of the original translation from 2006. Some of these corrections flipped the way Judas's role was portrayed, undercutting the earlier suggestion that he was actually a hero in the narrative. And that's when the real debate started heating up. By now, most of you watching are already confused about what to believe in. That feeling you have right now is exactly the feeling a lot of Christians had during the early days of Christianity. Christianity was like YouTube. Yes, it was that viral. Everyone wanted in on it. And if you sleep, breathe, and eat YouTube like I do, you would have come across certain content creators that you want to punch in the mouth for being mean or wicked. Well, that's exactly what it was back then. Everyone had an idea of how to maximize their idea of Christianity, and unfortunately, a lot of people believed in it. So we have the Gnostics, the Essenes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and these are the ones we know about. There was a lot. And can you guess which denomination the Gospel of Judas falls into? Well, the answer is Gnosticism, which, despite having Christian themes, is very different from what Christians do or believe. But the way Gnosticism blends in with Christian belief is so good that it could be hard for you to tell the difference. Gnosticism loosely overlaps with Christianity. While Gnostics and Christians agreed that the world was created by a god, Gnostics believed that there were multiple gods, including a transcendent God that is supremely good and an inferior creator God who made the material world. Gnostics adopted and interpreted several Christian teachings without adopting the standard beliefs of the Christian Church. Gnostics believe that the material world is associated with error and suffering. Moreover, they believe that the divine figure that created the material world is not supremely good or transcendent. They do believe there is such a transcendent God, but it did not create the imperfect material world. While there is a variety of Gnostic myths, most of them hold that there are several divine figures. The divine figure that created the material world is inferior to other divine figures that are purely intelligible, meaning they can be understood, but they are not in space and time. However, many Gnostics appeared to believe in a supreme God that was distinct from the creator God. So you see how easy it is for someone who came with a good Christian question to be diverted into Gnostic practice. I mean, this perfectly answers the question of, if God is good, then why did he make a world that is bad? A Christian, even a seasoned one, would tell you, I don't know, or say, it's because he respects our free will. Which might not be the answer everyone wants, but if a Gnostic simply says, it's because the world was created by a lesser being, and that the true God is perfect and different from the God of this world, it kind of gives you hope that it's not your fault but a higher being's fault. But this is all philosophical, and if you do want me to talk more about Christianity and gnosticism, of which is right and wrong, let me know in the comments section. Personally, I have a lot to say about both, as I have done ample research on both, but I'm not sure it's the kind of topic you would want. So if you want me to dissect both religions, let me know in the comments section, and if I get 50 approval from you guys, I will do a video on it. Now, weirdly enough, this wasn't even what discredited the Gospel of Judas for me. The people who made me weary of the Gospel of Judas were the same media trying to promote it. You see, it was a big moment when National Geographic finally pulled back the curtain in 2006. They had wrapped up years of restoration, translation, and high-stakes collaboration to bring the Gospel of Judas back into the public eye. But here's what really stirred the pot. One of the most outspoken critics on this issue was Professor April DeConnick, a respected scholar of early Christian texts. She took a close look at National Geographic's translation and was quick to call foul, not just once but repeatedly and publicly. DeConnick argued that the translation had some serious problems. Some of it, she said, looked like genuine mistakes, but she also left room for the possibility that certain choices weren't so innocent. That maybe, just maybe, there was a bit of selective storytelling going on. A key example was a passage from the Gospel of Judas. Coptic scholars refer to it as sections 46:24 to 47:1. In the version National Geographic put out, it read something like, "In the last days, they will curse your ascent to the holy generation," which sounds like Judas was still headed towards something sacred, even if others didn't like it. But De Koninck, after re-examining the original Coptic and the editorial decisions made in the first translation, came to a very different conclusion. She said the text actually reads, "You will not ascend to the holy generation." That one word flips everything. Instead of being on the path to some divine reward, Judas is now excluded from it. Denied entry. Shut out. Which, let's be honest, is a much less flattering interpretation. And that wasn't the only point of disagreement. De Koninck also took issue with the way the word daimon was translated. In Gnostic literature, she explained, it usually means demon. But in the initial publication, it was rendered as spirit. That sounds softer, doesn't it? But if Jesus was actually calling Judas a demon, or more specifically, the 13th demon, well, there goes the warm and fuzzy version of the story. So when you line up all these shifts in translation, De Konick's big picture argument becomes clear. In her view, the Gospel of Judas wasn't trying to rescue Judas's reputation. It was doubling down on his darkness. In her own words, he was as evil as ever. She laid all of this out in her book, The 13th Apostle, what the Gospel of Judas really says. And that book, not coincidentally, dropped right around the same time as her critical essay in the New York Times. Timing that didn't go unnoticed. But De Koninck wasn't the only one who had concerns. Another voice that chimed in was journalist Thomas Bartlett. In an essay for the Chronicle Review, he took a broader look at how the public had been introduced to the Gospel of Judas. His issue wasn't just with the translation, it was with the rollout itself. He pointed out that the first wave of exposure, the book, the press releases, the documentary, was built around a very specific story. That Judas had been wrongly villainized and maybe even acted heroically. But here's the thing, none of those early materials flagged the deep academic disagreements or the shaky ground some of the translation choices stood on. Later editions, yes, they made corrections, they added footnotes, but by then millions of people had already consumed the first version and taken it at face value. Bartlett also cited Craig A. Evans, a respected New Testament scholar who had originally been part of the Gospel of Judas project. Evans, he said, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the good Judas idea. According to Bartlett, Evans later called the first translation problematic and inaccurate. In a formal academic essay, Evans laid out how the first interpretations had leaned too heavily on limited fragments, and how later discoveries didn't support that early, optimistic spin. When a banned gospel suddenly gets a global audience, the stakes get high. Every word, every translation choice, every scholarly disagreement becomes part of a much bigger story about who controls history, who gets to interpret it, and how far we're willing to go to rewrite the roles of those long cast in stone. And just when you think the translation debate was heated enough, another layer of issue comes in, this time over authorship and historical credibility. Because even if the Gospel of Judas had been translated flawlessly, there's still one major issue scholars just can't get past. The timing. Historically speaking, this gospel shows up way too late to be considered a first-hand account. Most experts date it to the middle of the 2nd century, which means it was written at least 100 years after Judas Iscariot was long gone. That's a big gap. Too big, really, for anyone to argue it came from an actual eyewitness or anyone close to Jesus. And that's a problem if you're hoping to see it as a legitimate alternative to the 4 canonical Gospels. See, one of the basic requirements for getting into the New Testament canon was a direct link to an apostle, someone who was there, or at the very least someone who was close to someone who was there. That apostolic connection mattered a lot. So when a text like the Gospel of Judas comes along with a late date and anonymous authorship, scholars are quick to point out that it doesn't hold up as reliable history. Most likely the person who wrote it wasn't trying to report facts anyway. They were using Jesus and Judas as symbols, literary tools to talk about deeper ideas, the way the story's told, the terms it uses, the cosmic layers of divine beings. It's all built on a 2nd century framework, not 1st century Palestine. So, no matter how intriguing it might be, this gospel doesn't tell us much about the actual Judas, who walked with Jesus. What it does tell us is what some Christians over a century later believed he could represent. And while the timeline issue was already a deal breaker for a lot of scholars, the theological content raised even more red flags. Early Christian thinkers, especially those known as the Church Fathers, spent a lot of time pushing back against ideas that didn't match the core of Christian teaching. In Gnosticism, a truly good God wouldn't even touch the material universe. Instead, creation is passed off to a lesser being that is sometimes ignorant or sometimes just outright evil. In the Gospel of Judas, this lower being is an angel named Sacklus. He's the one who creates Adam and Eve, not God directly, which flips the Genesis story completely on its head. Instead of saying that God made the world and called it good, this text paints the material world as something almost accidental, or worse, something to escape from. This kind of thinking wasn't new to 2nd century readers. It showed up in other Gnostic writings too, where Jesus isn't necessarily the Son of God in a straightforward way. He's more like a spiritual guide who slips down from some higher, hidden realm to rescue souls trapped in the physical world. In some texts, he doesn't even suffer on the cross. One account even claims that Simon of Cyrene, the guy forced to carry the cross, was the one actually crucified. Jesus, according to that version, just watched it happen and laughed. That's a pretty major detour from anything found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And it's part of why early Christian leaders were so firm in drawing a line. For them, inspired scripture had to be consistent with everything that came before. That meant no contradictions, no reinventions of God's character, and definitely no alternate cosmologies involving layers of invisible beings and a flawed creator angel named Sacklus. So while the Gospel of Judas might offer a fascinating snapshot of a belief system that was once in circulation, it's not hard to see why it was left out of the canon. It doesn't just tweak the story, it rebuilds the entire frame. That's like watching the Avengers movie and saying the Avengers is made up of teenage mutant ninja turtles instead of the actual original members. No one would take you seriously. Even a child would laugh at you. And that is what the Gospel of Judas did. Of course, all of this brings us to a practical question no one can really ignore. Even if you're willing to entertain the theology, what are we actually working with here? The text itself. The physical thing. Well, not much. When scholars finally got their hands on the manuscript known as the Codex Chakos, it wasn't exactly a clean, crisp, ancient book. It was more like a mess of confetti with aspirations. The thing had shredded into what some experts described as over 1,000 pieces. And I mean that literally. It didn't just look rough, it was falling apart every time someone touched it. Originally, there were 62 pages. Only 13 survived. That's about 80% of the remaining text eventually reconstructed, which is impressive. But depending on who you ask, up to a third of it is still illegible. Just blank space, missing lines, gaps in the middle of conversations that might have told us a whole lot more, or might have cleared up the way certain words were meant to be read. And that's the tricky part, because in Coptic, a single word can have shades of meaning. If you're working with fragments, even small translation decisions can shift the tone. One reading might show Judas as enlightened and chosen. Another could make him look like a pawn who's been tricked. That's a pretty big swing. So when people argue over what this gospel really says, part of the tension comes from this huge elephant in the room. We don't even have the full thing. The Gospel of Judas, already dismissed for its timing and theology, now had a third strike, its broken, incomplete body. Also, the Gospel of Judas isn't some lone rebel manuscript. It's part of a much bigger group of early Christian writings that never made it into the New Testament. Some were forgotten. Others, like this one, were outright rejected. Think of the Gospel of Thomas, which is basically a list of sayings attributed to Jesus. Or the Gospel of Mary, where Mary Magdalene plays a major role in a post-resurrection conversation with the disciples. There's also the Gospel of Philip, which has been raising eyebrows for years, thanks to how it talks about Jesus and Mary in a strangely personal way. And then there's the Apocryphon of John, which looks into cosmic hierarchies and divine emanations, very on brand for Gnostic spirituality. All of these fall outside what mainstream Christianity came to accept, and most of them don't try to fit in. They reflect a version of faith that feels more mystical, more philosophical, and honestly a lot less focused on historical events, and more on inner knowledge and spiritual layers. That's one of the reasons critics push back. These texts, including the Gospel of Judas, might tell us a lot about how beliefs were shifting in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. but they don't tell us much about the actual Jesus who lived in 1st century Palestine. Even early church leaders weren't subtle about this. Irenaeus and Epiphanius went after texts like these hard. They didn't just say, well, this might not be helpful. They flat out called them false stories. They saw them as confusing fiction that pulled people away from what they believed was the truth handed down from the apostles. And while modern readers might find these writings fascinating, especially for what they reveal about the variety of early Christian thinking, most scholars today still agree with those early critics. And I also agree with them. I mean, even the Ethiopian Bible doesn't have it, and that is one of the most untouched Bibles in the world. If the Ethiopian Bible doesn't have it, then it is mostly false. In such, here is a video on the Ethiopian Bible and why it is still being used in Ethiopia as we speak.